Hello viewers. I recently made a video about the Weimar Republic, in which I expressed an opinion that the Treaty of Versailles was basically alright and that the German reaction to it stemmed mostly from perception rather than the actual contents of the treaty. I know that this channel is focused on countries that used to exist, but I thought I would take some time to make a quick video explaining my viewpoint and why I maintain that the treaty was appropriate. If you disagree, I'm not trying to pick on you, I just think that we've had a century of trashing Versailles, and most of the reasons people give for it are either outright false or at best misleading. In any case, history is an interpretation of the available facts with no right answer, so even if you disagree, I hope that this video can at least give you some other factors to take into account. For the sake of demonstrating my point, I also have two contemporaneous peace treaties to compare Versailles to. The first is the treaty that ended the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which is unfortunately also called the Treaty of Versailles, and the second is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the Eastern Front in 1918. I'll be referencing these throughout the video. Anyway, I've made a list of the most famous clauses that people take issue with, and I'll be going through them one by one. This is one of the big ones that people talk about, and it's also the easiest for me to dismiss because it's a myth. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is known as the War Guilt Clause, because it supposedly lays the blame for the entire war on Germany and makes Germany completely responsible for repairing the damages. This idea was spread heavily in Nazi propaganda in the 20s and 30s, which is partly why it's still so famous today. It's just that it's not true. The article reads, "Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments have been subjected to as a consequence of the war." Now, taken out of context, that does indeed make it sound like Germany was being blamed for the whole thing, which is why it was good propaganda. However, allow me to draw your attention to Article 177 of the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, or the one that Austria has to sign. Article 177 states that Austria accepts the responsibility of Austria and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments have been subjected to as a consequence of the war. Yes, that text is indeed identical except for the name. Let's look at the Treaty of Neuilly-sur-Seine, or as you may know it, the one that Bulgaria had to sign. Bulgaria recognizes that by joining the war of aggression in which Germany and Austria-Hungary waged against the Allied and associated powers, she has caused to the latter losses and sacrifices of all kinds for which she ought to make complete reparations. Well, at least the Bulgarians got a different paragraph. In any case, I think I've made my point. The so-called War Guilt Clause did not put the blame for the war entirely on Germany. The article is a legal technicality that explains why reparations are being paid, and a similar article was given to all members of the Central Powers. In fact, unlike other peace treaties of the time period, the reparations weren't even a punishment. A small but significant article after 231 states that the Allied and associated governments recognize that the resources of Germany are not adequate to make complete reparations for all such loss and damage. The Allied and associated governments, however, require, and Germany undertakes, that she will make compensation for all damage done to the civilian population of the Allied and associated powers, and to their property during the period of belligerency. Germany was not only not being blamed, it was having the reparations centered entirely around the damage done to civilian populations. There was no hint of a punitive measure. So forget about the War Guilt Clause because it doesn't exist. It's a poorly phrased legal technicality blown out of proportion by a century of propaganda. After the Franco-Prussian War, Germany made France pay reparations of 5 billion francs, which is somewhere between $300 to $500 billion today. Germany also occupied the entirety of northern France until the indemnity was paid in full. In 1918, Germany made Russia pay reparations of 6 billion gold marks, and was granted a full 25% of Baku's oil production. So immediately we've established that reparations are completely standard in principle. But what about the amount? With the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was made to pay 132 billion gold marks, which is a lot, but as always there's nuance here. 82 billion of these were completely interest-free and would only need to be paid when the Allies deemed Germany was able. When Germany had trouble paying its reparations, the American government gave them low-interest loans to help cover it, and in 1928 the Americans took 20 billion marks off the reparations and lowered the amount needed with each installment. When the Great Depression struck, the Allies stopped collecting payments altogether. All in all, Germany ended up paying less than 1/6 of the reparations before the Allies just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said that's fine and cancelled the mandatory payments. So yes, Germany did owe a lot of money, but not nearly as much as it initially sounds like, and Germany was also one of the richest countries in the world. So why did the economy collapse so spectacularly in the 1920s? Well, the fact that they had just had a world war didn't help. The entire war was funded by debt that Germany assumed it would pay back by forcing reparations on the Allies. Once they lost the war, however, they were massively in debt and had to pay it back. The Germans printed money to pay back their debt, which caused inflation, which made borrowing money to pay reparations difficult, which made the French occupy the Ruhr. When the workers in the Ruhr went on strike, the German government gave them printed money to spite the French, which just made the inflation worse. So yes, the reparations certainly played a role in the economic collapse, but they certainly don't deserve the weight of blame that's often assigned to them. Reparations didn't collapse the German economy. The German government collapsed the German economy. I'm going to divide the territorial losses into European and colonial territories. Let's get colonies out of the way first. Germany lost all of its colonies in the war. That's fine. All the colonies combined contained under 24,000 Germans, and the German government didn't really want the colonies anyway. In fact, the history of the German colonial empire is almost amusing in the fact that Germany kept ending up with more colonies despite being at best only mildly interested in them as a matter of pride. Not even the Nazis made a big deal about getting these back, and territorial expansion was kind of their whole thing. They also cost a massive amount to maintain, and any resources found in these colonies Germany could just trade for anyway. Losing the colonies may have actually been a net positive for the German economy. Now, as for Europe, Germany lost 13% of its land and around 10% of its population. But as I said in the Weimar video, this was land that contained mostly ethnic minorities that by and large wanted to be part of the new countries anyway. The areas with significant German populations still had a majority of their population as something else. Either way, people will end up outside their preferred country, and at least this way most people were satisfied. Now there are exceptions to this that I'll go through. Danzig was a German majority city that for Allied political reasons was separated from Germany against the wishes of its people. But even then, efforts were made to ensure the Germans retained their self-government. The Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia was mostly Germans, but that doesn't really count towards Versailles at all. Czechoslovakia had seceded from the Austro-Hungarian Empire before Germany's defeat, and the Allies had no more say over Czechoslovak sovereignty than Peru. The Saar Basin was split off from Germany against the wishes of most people, which I'll talk about more in the next section. But by and large, in areas where there was a significant dispute over which nation should hold the territory, plebiscites were held and popular opinion determined the land's ownership. This is very much dissimilar to how Russia was treated by Germany. Russia lost 34% of its population and over half of its industrial area in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which set the precedent for a treaty at the end of a world war. With that in mind, the territorial losses of Germany seem if anything generous. Yeah, I'm not going to lie, this one sucked, and is frankly in my view one of the few legitimate criticisms of the treaty. The Saar Basin, which contained important industrial areas and a population of nearly 1 million Germans, was split off from Germany and occupied by the French and British until 1935. However, even this was never meant to be permanent. The arrangement was always that after 15 years a vote would be held, and if people wished to return to Germany they could, which was exactly what happened in 1935. Additionally, the Ruhr was occupied by the French between 1923 and 1925, following German defaults on their reparation payments. This wasn't part of the Treaty of Versailles though, the French just did this to ensure that Germany made its payments, which was wrong of them. That being said, Germany did the exact same thing to France 50 years before, and to Russia in 1918. Again, it's not exactly beyond the pale for the time period. This was simply what was done to a defeated foe. This one actually isn't part of the treaty, but a few people brought it up, so I thought I would discuss it anyway. Germany during the war was blockaded. The First World War famously ended on the 11th of November 1918, and yet the blockade continued until well into 1919, causing considerable suffering among the people of Germany. So why wasn't the blockade lifted until July 1919? Was it an act of spite or punishment from the Allies? No, basically it wasn't lifted because the war wasn't over until June 1919. Now I know that the 11th of November is when most people think the First World War ended, except that it isn't. 1918 is when the fighting stopped and an agreed upon ceasefire came into effect, which makes it a convenient place to say the war ended. But it's not when the war actually ended. And at the time, with the Allies having no way of knowing what the internal situation of Germany was, there seemed to be a good chance that the Germans would use the temporary ceasefire to rearm and attempt a new offensive in the next year. That's also why soldiers were attacking until the very last moment. At the time, there was no way of knowing whether it was the actual end to the conflict or simply a lapse in the fighting. The blockade wasn't lifted for the same reason South Korea and North Korea don't trade. Because the Allies and Germany were still at war until the peace treaty was signed, and you don't allow the enemy to trade if it will allow them to kill you more easily. In any case, the Allies offered to allow Germany to import food if the Germans transferred control of their ships to Allied hands. This was to ensure that the ships were only used for essential humanitarian aid. Germany, however, chose not to accept this deal until March 1919, when the food situation had grown even worse. After this, the Allies shipped hundreds of thousands of tons of food to Germany per month until even after the blockade had been lifted. Again, the blockade is something that sounds terrible out of context, which is why it's rarely given context. There is no doubt in my mind that the Treaty of Versailles was one of the many factors that led to the rise of the Nazis and subsequently the Second World War. But it's not because the treaty crippled the Germans. It's because the Germans lost and they didn't like it much. So that's my opinion on the Treaty of Versailles. It was fairly boilerplate for the time period, and has since had its reputation blackened by a century of propaganda and a general feeling among the Germans that they hadn't been defeated, so it was unfair. If I haven't convinced you to agree with me, I hope I've at least been able to give you a few new things to think about. Thanks for watching.